Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this unique session on market conduct and investor protection. Today, we live in a world of rapidly evolving financial markets. Ensuring ethical behavior, regulatory compliance, and safeguarding the investors' interest is far more critical than ever. To guide you through today's discussion, we are honored to have distinguished guests whose expertise and insights in the field are truly commendable. We are fortunate to have with us an esteemed panel of experts who brings diverse perspectives from legal enforcement to market behavior analysis and investor education. Together, we will delve today into key trends, challenges, solutions that drive trust in the financial system. Let us begin with introducing our panelists. Ms. Elisa Chencheng from Norges Bank Investment Management, Head of Policy, and Mr. Khalid Slaiti, Director of Governance and Disclosure. So I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Thank you so much to QFMA for the invitation. And pleased to share the stage with the esteemed panelists. Some of them are, I'm sure, on their way. So hope they'll join us. So I'm indeed Head of Policy Engagement at Norges Bank Investment Management, which is the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. So just by way of introduction, we manage around 1.5 trillion USD worldwide. We allocate most of this, around 70% in listed equity and the rest in fixed income, with some allocation to renewable energy infrastructure and unlisted real estate as well. And we have, to give you an idea, about 1 billion USD invested in Qatari equities as well.
Mr. Khalid, can you give us a brief about your unit and your position, please?
في البداية أشكركم على الاستضافة هذه وإثراء المناقشة فيما يتعلق بحماية المستثمرين. خالد سيف سليطي، مدير إدارة الحوكمة والإفصاح في هيئة قطر للأسواق المالية. يرتكز دور إدارة الحوكمة والإفصاح على تطبيق مبادئ الحوكمة على الشركات المدرجة في الأسواق المالية ومراقبة مدى التزامهم بمتطلبات الحوكمة والإفصاح.
Okay, we will start with your talk, Mr. Elisa, until Mrs. Elisa, until they arrive. Okay.
So do you want to start with the question or just?
Yeah. Shall I? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let me direct this question to leave the floor to you. The first question is, how can international legal frameworks, cross-border regulatory competitors help address challenges in investor protection, particularly in globalized financial markets? So this is the first question.
Yes, thank you very much. So we heard several of the esteemed speakers today already talk about the importance of cross-border coordination and regulation, and specifically global principles for globalized financial markets. As a global investor, global principles have always been key for us. So that these are the basis of our own approach to responsible investment, to stewardship, and to engagement with investee companies. And they're also the basis of our policy engagement. So my team is acting mostly on corporate governance and corporate disclosures. And we've been for a long time advocating for the development and also for the adoption across different jurisdictions of strong global standards. So in this space, we've been particularly supportive of the work of the OECD on corporate governance and the work of the ISSB and the IFRS Foundation on international sustainability-related financial disclosure standards. And we're actually very pleased to see that the Qatari regulators are moving in this direction as well, and IOSCO has been, had endorsed the ISSB principles. So globalized financial markets need to be based on a solid foundation of global principles. Companies active and investing cross borders need that kind of baseline of regulation. And we've heard different panelists and different speakers today already talking about the importance of this. And this is not just because it reduces the compliance burden or the reporting burden, whatever the issue at stake might be. It also because it eliminates inconsistencies in regulation. So it's important that especially when you're tackling cross-border systemic challenges, you start with a global principles baseline. And that's why the work of IOSCO, ISSB, the Financial Stability Board is so important. So ideally, and that's not always the case, and it's not always feasible, but ideally you'd start with that global principles first, and then you move to the regulatory adoption at the domestic level. Obviously, global principles by themselves, they don't have a binding force, and they're not able, for a variety of reasons, to completely adapt to the specificities of the local markets and the local context. So they need to be given binding force by the regulators, and they need to be adapted. And that's absolutely important. But that should be, and in an ideal situation, the logical order that you follow. And we've seen this in a variety of cases with global standard setters really coming first and then being followed by the domestic regulators. So to give you an example, on an issue that we've been active on is ESG ratings. When kind of this market product has kind of become really, really quite important in a sustainability and sustainable finance over the last few years, and IOSCO was quite pretty early on in terms of developing a set of global principles and recommendations around 2020, 2021 to potentially regulate this product. And then we've seen the different domestic regulators such as Japan, UK, Europe moving to implement and adopt these principles in the domestic context, whereas either through a binding regulatory approach or through a kind of industry code of conduct, soft law approach. So it's been great to see the consistency of this domestic regulatory framework with the global principles, which had been set first. On sustainability reporting, which is an area we've been very, very engaged on, it hasn't been quite so simple, I would say. There we've had the development of a variety of different frameworks and standards over the last 10 to 20 years. So you have GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, you have TCFD, you have TNFD, you have SASB, and there's been a lot of consolidation within the IFRS Foundation and the International Sustainability Standards Board, which we've welcomed. So they managed to absorb the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the Integrated Reporting Framework, but still there was a degree of developing those ISSB global standards at the same time as several jurisdictions were moving ahead. For example, the EU with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the ESRSs, the jurisdiction-specific reporting standards. So then you have to kind of work a little bit ex post to try and make these frameworks interoperable. And that's not quite the same as alignment, because it allows you, yes, to see the cross-references and how different matters and different topics are tackled in different standards, but it's not quite so easy then for market participants to comply with different regimes and also for us as an investor to compare the different disclosures.
If I may keep this beautiful conversation alive, can we know what is your take on financial literacy and capacity building, just to build the investor confidence? What is your take on that?
Sure. So this is not an area that, as an institutional investor, we're particularly active on. So I'll offer my personal maybe reflections more than our institutional MBIM view. So capacity building and financial education. It's clear that securities regulators have a role to play there, and IOSCO and also OECD have been doing great work there. But it's also equally clear to me that when you talk about financial education for retail investors, securities regulators and disclosure-based regimes can only go so far and can only do so much. There's an important role to play there for other governmental authorities, for education ministries. Financial education needs to start in school. There's many countries around the world where there's really not a culture of retail investment, and there's a variety of cultural reasons, historical reasons, and legacy reasons for that. From that, I'm from Italy, so it's one of those countries where less than 10%, I believe, of households have any investments in capital markets. But we also have success stories, obviously, not just the US, we have success stories in Europe, such as Sweden. So financial education in school, tax incentives are very important as well. And Sweden again offers an example where tax savings account have proven really critical to kind of to incentivize that investment in capital markets and ultimately the growth of a solid domestic institutional base.
Thank you for your valuable insight. We're happy to have Mrs. Dravel Rowland, the Deputy Governor of Consumer and Investor Protection, the Central Bank of Ireland. If you allow us to give the floor to Mr. Khalid, then we'll give the floor to you, absolutely. الأستاذ خالد السليطي. ممكن تتفضل.
مشكورة دكتورة. First of all, allow me to speak in Arabic. So there is a translator if anyone want to hear. في البداية حاب أسلط الضوء على حماية المستثمرين ومدى أهميته للجهات الرقابية. اليوم حماية المستثمرين يعتبر هدف رئيسي لأي جهة تنظيمية. اليوم لو ننظر على الأسواق المالية هي أسواق منظمة، والسوق المالي يعتبر نفس أي سوق. اليوم لو غابت هذه التشريعات أو غابت الأمور التنظيمية عن أي سوق فراح يصير عزوف للمتعاملين أو المتداولين، ومن هنا يأتي دور الجهة التنظيمية على أسواق رأس المال، ولما أخص دورها فيما يتعلق بالدور التنظيمي. اليوم الجهات الرقابية على أسواق رأس المال تختص بثلاث أدوار رئيسية، منها عملية تنظيم الأسواق المالية وعملية الإشراف وعملية الرقابة. لما نسلط الضوء على الدور التنظيمي للجهات الرقابية من خلال عملية سن التشريعات، وشلون ممكن تلعب الجهات الرقابية في حماية المستثمرين من خلال عملية سن التشريعات وتعزيز حماية المستثمر في السوق المالي. في المقام الأول يجب على الجهة التنظيمية المشرفة على تنظيم أسواق رأس المال حظر التلاعبات في الأسواق المالية واستغلال المعلومات الاستغلال الخاطئ أو حتى حظر السلوك. معظم الجهات الرقابية على مستوى العالم ما أحظرت فقط بل جرمت حتى عملية التلاعب بالأسواق المالية لجريمة جنائية يعاقب عليها القانون. هذا التجريم جاء لحماية المستثمرين ولزيادة ثقتهم بالسوق المالي. على سبيل المثال قمنا في هيئة قطر للأسواق المالية مؤخراً بإصدار ضوابط لسلوكيات التعامل في السوق المالي اللي كانت منبثقة عن القانون اللي حظر التلاعبات في الأسواق المالية، وجاءت هذه الضوابط حتى لتشرح أنواع وأشكال وأنماط التلاعبات في الأسواق المالية، وذلك لتعزيز حماية المستثمرين لدى المتداولين وزيادة ثقتهم في السوق المالي وبالأخص بالجهة الرقابية. ممكن بعد أضيف على يجب على الجهات التنظيمية سن تشريعات فيما يتعلق بأطر الحوكمة والإفصاح والتي ترتكز على حماية المستثمرين. ولما نتكلم عن نظم الحوكمة فهي عملية كيفية إدارة الشركات المدرجة، ومن خلالها يتم فصل تعارض المهام اللي موجودة في إدارة الشركات المدرجة. اليوم مثل ما احنا عارفين الشركات المدرجة هي عبارة عن رؤوس أموال لعدة مستثمرين يتم إدارتها من خلال مجلس إدارة منتخب من هؤلاء المستثمرين، وبالتالي جاءت أطر الحوكمة لفصل المهام وفصل الصلاحيات وتحديد الأدوار والمهام في عملية الشركة. لما ننظر لهذه العملية بشكلها الكامل فهي كلها تصف حماية المستثمرين في الأسواق المالية. لما نتكلم عن الجانب الآخر يجب على الجهات التنظيمية ذلك وضع متطلبات للإفصاح للشركات المدرجة وللأسواق المالية. عملية الإفصاح حقيقة هي عملية جدا كبيرة فيها عديد من المتطلبات الإفصاح. على سبيل المثال يجب على الجهات التنظيمية وضع ضوابط للإفصاح عن البيانات المالية في أماكن ومواعيد محددة، وذلك لاطلاع المستثمرين والمتعاملين فيها على أداء الشركة سواء من الناحية المالية أو حتى في خططها المستقبلية أو في حال تعثرها. هناك العديد من متطلبات الإفصاح، كذلك من ضمنها الأخبار الجوهرية للشركات المدرجة، قائمة بأشخاص المطلعين، قائمة بتداولات الأشخاص المطلعين. يحضرني بعد قمنا في هيئة قطر للأسواق المالية مؤخراً بتعزيز هذه الضوابط، وتم التزام السوق المالي عندنا في بورصة قطر بالإفصاح عن تداولات الأشخاص المطلعين بشكل يومي. في السابق كنا نفصح عن تداولات الأشخاص المطلعين دون ذكر الأسماء. اليوم عززنا من هذه الشفافية والنزاهة في التعامل في السوق القطري بالإفصاح عن أسماء الأشخاص المطلعين في الشركات المدرجة. هناك أيضا ضوابط يجب على الجهة التنظيمية فرضها فيما يتعلق بعمليات السيطرة وعدم اتخاذ القرار في الشركات المدرجة. لما ننظر لجميع هذه التشريعات وضعت لحماية المستثمرين في المبدأ الأول، وكلها تعتبر يعني الحد الأدنى لحماية المستثمرين في التعاملات أو في السوق المالي. وحاب أضيف نقطة أن جميع هذه التشريعات لما يتم وضعها صحيح هي لحماية المستثمر، ولكن يجي الدور التفعيلي لها من خلال قيام الجهات التنظيمية بعملية الرقابة والتأكد من إنفاذ هذه القوانين. لما تقوم الجهة التنظيمية بعملية إنفاذ القوانين، هذا اللي راح يعطي الثقة للمستثمرين أن هذا السوق منظم من قبل جهات تنظيمية رقابية تحرص على حماية المستثمرين.
أستاذ خالد، شكراً على الكلمات الفنية والمفردات الفنية اللي هي ممكن تكون غريبة على غير المتخصصين، وشكراً على الإنسايت وجهة النظر أنك تكلمت عن الجهات التنظيمية وكيف هي ممكن تعزز معايير السلوك. بس ممكن توضح لنا وجهة نظرك، هل هذه الأمور كلها راح تساهم في ضمان المنافسة العادلة؟ حضرتك تفضلت أنت جاوبتها بطريقة، بس إحنا نبي نركز على المنافسة العادلة. إيش هو الانعكاس الفعلي في الواقع المادي للمنافسة العادلة؟ كلمة المنافسة العادلة.
نعم صحيح. المنافسة العادلة هي من خلال عملية الإفصاح. لما اليوم الجهة التنظيمية تفرض عمليات ومتطلبات الإفصاح في السوق المالي، هي تخلي القرار عند المستثمر أو جميع المستثمرين في نفس الوقت. هي المنافسة العادلة معناته أن اليوم المعلومة المتطلب الإفصاح على الشركة لما تطلع المعلومة تكون متوفرة للكل في نفس الوقت ونفس المكان. هذه تضمن النزاهة والشفافية في التعاملات في الأسواق المالية.
شكرا لك أستاذ خالد. Now we'll leave the floor to Mrs. Dravel Roland. You can go. Yes. Did you want to ask me? Let me start by asking you a question. What is the legal reform or policy initiatives that are needed to improve financial literacy and capacity building as a tool for strengthening the investor confidence? What is your take on that?
So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to contribute to this discussion. It's a real honor, and we've been hosted so well. My deep appreciation. I think what we have learned over time is that for effective capital markets and capacity building, there's a number of elements that need to be in place so that we have the conditions for a fair, orderly, and trustworthy market to exist. And of course, we've heard from others about the right rules, the right policy frameworks that need to be in place, giving confidence and transparency. But if we want individuals to participate in capital markets, then we need to make sure that there's a number of elements in place. You've heard from others, of course, and this would be a wider set of responsibilities than the securities regulator. We need to have education and literacy programs so that our people understand the importance of making good financial decisions for themselves to support themselves as they go through different life stages. So that's about mathematical literacy, it's about business goals literacy, and of course, it's about money management. Then you need, what we've learned over time, is information that is provided at the time that you need it. Most of us cannot absorb the kind of information in complicated transactions all at once. We all are very naturally inclined to focus on information when it's at the point in time that you need it. So that's a second kind of information that our societies need to make available. which is just-in-time information at the point of making transactions or entering into transactions, so that you have a general foundation and then specifically helpful information. And of course, you have to have that from trusted sources, so that the information is good quality, fair, accurate, and misleading. And a lot of countries are taking contributions from financial services firms, from government authorities and agencies, from regulators, and putting it into a strategic package, so that all of those efforts are aligned in the right direction to deliver the strategy at different points, and then it's being measured. So I think, pardon me, it's not just one answer. There's a number of elements that have to be put in place. But there's something else that we have to consider very carefully, is digital literacy. Because the way that we transact in the modern world is through, we all know we do everything on our phones now. So it's really important for inclusion, and might I say the other element in some countries is to make sure that both men and women have the kind of literacy that they need, so that everyone has the information and the confidence to participate well in financial markets. So digital literacy is just as important as making sure we reach the target audiences. And what we're noticing in some countries, finally I will say, is that younger people don't want to interact in old-fashioned ways. They really only want to interact through digital means. And a lot of them, their first point of contact is actually through high-risk trades, particularly, for example, crypto seems to be quite attractive to young men. And they're not actually involved in some of the regulated market infrastructure. So I think it's really important to understand your audience, to understand their particular specific areas of focus, and to make sure that there's a real understanding about the risk and about the regulated markets and about where you can make different kinds of risk-based decisions for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you for your fair representation in terms of men and women. So we do have a fair panel today. So this is really related to what we're talking about. My question is, when you mentioned the illiteracy, you said math, business, information. What about law?
Yeah, well, as a lawyer myself, of course, that comes into it. But I think it's not really fair to expect individuals to understand law. I think they want us to understand the law and to provide them the protections that they need. I think what I've learned over time is that you need the right policy frameworks in place, and I have to say IOSCO, as a global standard setter, is doing a fantastic job in setting standards that we can all follow, and of course an awful lot of countries and jurisdictions will turn that into law. And then IOSCO will do capacity building. Certainly there are organisations that will check the effectiveness of your legal policy frameworks, but there's something else as a regulator that's very dear to my heart, which is expectation setting. So you can have a lot of law, but it's not well used or well understood. So it's very important that the regulator makes very clear expectations about high standards. And there are some really good ways of making sure you deliver on that, which is communication every year about what you expect, so that if that doesn't happen, I heard my fellow panelists talk about subsequent enforcement actions. Of course, it's better not to have to take enforcement. It's much better that the expectations are met, and that can often happen through good governance, good risk control frameworks, good expectation setting, and things will go wrong in firms, but what you would want them to do is fix it quickly, take responsibility, and move on. And that's actually about attitude and expectation, the spirit of the law, rather than the words. So sometimes that's just as important.
So this is an invitation to steer away from legalese and stick to simple English, which is much better, right? Yeah. Thank you. That was really insightful. So we'll move to Mr. Neil Akres. If I may ask you the first question, which is, how can international legal framework, cross-border regulatory cooperation help address challenges in investor protection, particularly in globalized financial markets?
Yes, well, thank you very much, and apologies for running in late, but I was under the IOSCO curse of bilateral meetings. So it's a curse and a pleasure in terms of meeting so many people but not having my eyes set on the panel. So apologies for that, but thank you again for the kind invitation to participate in the discussion today, and in particular for the moderator for kindly inviting me to this particular panel. Look, to answer your question, I'm always, I suppose, a little bit contrarian in terms of how I answer questions. Maybe I should be a politician. But I focus on certain elements of the question, in particular, cross-border enforcement and cross-border engagement. And I think the challenge that I think we see is that when I started out as a sort of fresh-eyed regulator at the time, I promised myself that I wouldn't make this statement when I eventually ended up in industry, and I think 20 years on, I'm making that statement, and I am that person who's going to say international cooperation and international coordination is so important for us as a global financial market participant. Now, the disheartening part, and maybe the contrarian part, is I'm at this point in time nervous in terms of whether that is just an objective that we'll never actually be able to achieve. And the reason why I say that is I look most recently at an opportunity for us as a global financial market ecosystem to achieve the coordination. And I look at the opportunity being set through sustainability standards, ISSB in particular, and an opportunity of having great tailwinds in terms of policymakers wanting to find international coordination, market participants wanting to have market coordination, politicians wanting to have market coordination. And we find ourselves with a great start in terms of everybody adopting ISSB, and that was the plan, and everybody's excited. And then we started to see words like interoperability start getting thrown into the mix, which I hate, because it shows that we're already moving away from the objective. And now, as we stand here today, we have ISSB proper, we have ISSB plus, ISSB minus, no ISSB, ISSB bespoke. And it just shows that I think the ideal of what we maybe set ourselves out for is maybe not achievable. And maybe I need to reset my expectations in terms of saying maybe we won't actually be able to get there. So that doesn't mean we're at the end and IOSCO doesn't have a purpose. Of course, IOSCO has a purpose. And I think what we need to reshape is towards more principles and policies underlying those objectives. So if we don't ever get to a place where the underlying detail is where it needs to be, do we need to refocus and reshape in terms of going back to the core principles of what drives market conduct and market integrity, fairness, transparency, integrity, due care, governance structures, etc., that we can all agree is what we want to have, and that's absolutely embedded in the IOSCO principles, and focus on a principles-based approach that we then can apply globally.
Just one final question to keep up with the panel, because I asked them all about the financial illiteracy. So what is your take about that? What is the effect of financial literacy in general?
Yes, sure. So I have two observations on that. Financial literacy, the one thing I'll say is I'm observing is that in my discussions with regulators globally, my one concern about financial literacy is that we, for example, at MSCI, only have institutional clients. The discussions that we have when we're talking about disclosure and transparency and literacy is always through a retail lens. And my fear is that twofold, is that there's a balance in the middle, but my fear is if it's always through a very heavy retail lens, one, our clients who are using the products are asking for a level of sophistication in the disclosures and transparency and the literature that we give them that explains what they're investing in, explains what the nature of the, for example, index is that they're using. If we start adjusting that to retail language that's very broad and open, they are not going to get what they need, and they're not going to get it in the format that they need. I don't say that there isn't an opportunity to use plain language and to use absolutely understandable language, fully agree. But we need to be careful about always looking necessarily through a full retail lens. The second part is where you have a product or service that is generally available for people to read and to see, there is a risk that retail investors start thinking that they can use the product and they can use the service even though it's not suited for them. This is not a huge observation, it's just something to be aware of, that we need to find that balance between levels of disclosure and what makes sense globally. But to answer your question specifically in terms of what we see, and I took a look back and said, if we were developing a financial literacy program, what would it look like? And I think there were three observations I had. The first is, I think, assume a scenario where we're all in a sector which broadly the products and services that we offer are all regulated products and services. I think when we have a new product and we decide to develop a regulatory system around that product, we need to have stronger engagement from all stakeholders as we develop that regulatory framework. That's from academics to policymakers to the actual creators of the financial product. Because what that does is, as we're developing that regulatory system, we build common goals and common initiatives in terms of what the actual product is, what it's meant to actually do, and how policies are meant to actually ensure that the right and appropriate conduct surrounds that product. And so you build it from the ground up, right till the end, by building that sort of common initiative. The second part, I would say, is that, and I hear this all the time, is, oh, we need to educate regulators. We need to have regulatory programs for regulators to help them understand how we do our business. I actually think we need to focus on the other way around in terms of how we educate and ensure that there is an understanding of products and services within financial institutions themselves. I'm still shocked when I go out to what I would say very sophisticated financial institutions, and they say, oh, we're invested in the index. You can't invest in an index. You invest in a product that's benchmarked to an index. And so I think there is a literacy problem, not only in terms of when we talk about it from a retail perspective, but from an institutional perspective and a financial institution perspective. And so for point two, my view is what I think would happen, I think regulators could really help here. We obviously have the annual conferences, which are fantastic, like this is really great. But within jurisdictions, to have regulators bring together in small groups different parts of the financial ecosystem where we can work together and say, hey, what is an index? What is an ESG rating, for example? How does this work? How is it used? Smaller pockets of the market, because you then get, one, not only buy-in in terms of what the actual service is or what the tool is, but you also then you build confidence in your counterparties. Like, who is actually in this market? We all understand each other, we all understand what the focus is, and we move from there. The third and final point on literacy is, again, the critical of having an ongoing monitoring and measurement program. Are we actually measuring and monitoring what we're putting in place, or do we have a program that just runs year on year in terms of disclosures, in terms of literature that's out there, but it's not actually achieving the goals of what we have? So feedback loops and mechanisms and adjusting and being nimble in terms of how we do that, I think from an institutional perspective, not from a retail perspective, is going to help us a lot.
Thank you for your institutional perspective. Given the fact that we have one-of-a-kind panel, I'll use this chance to grant you all the floor one more time to give me, myself, and our esteemed audience one takeaway when it comes to your fields. So please, Mrs. Dravel.
I think regulation and securities markets should be forward-looking and risk-based. And for me then, the opportunity we have to harness the benefits of technology for scale, efficiency, in a way, democratization of participation in capital markets is something really excellent. So my takeaway would be that regulation should be technology neutral, because for me it doesn't matter if it's a traditional transaction face-to-face, or if it's a technology-supported transaction, the investor outcomes should be the same. But I think we need to embrace modernity and moving forward, but in a way that can cope with encompassing the benefits of technology, but making sure we still deliver on the outcomes so that we have fair, transparent, open markets.
Gentlemen.
Thank you. I'll just build on what Neil just said. So I made the example earlier on the difference between the ISSB standard, and I also challenged I also raised some of the challenges in its adoption and the regulatory fragmentation compared to the IOSCO principles on ESG ratings. It's just one example. So this just to me highlights the difference between global principles and global standard setting. So it's increasingly clear to us all, I think, that standard setting at a global level is becoming increasingly challenging, which is not a reason in itself to abandon the ambition, but perhaps a call for the global regulatory community to really focus on an outcomes-based approach and on a principle-based approach as much as possible. That's where it's easiest to find common ground, and it's also much easier to to maintain a forward-looking approach and to keep up to speed with innovation. Standard setting by itself, because of due process need and a lot of other, the need to find a consensus takes a lot of time. So the more you can use a principle-based approach and focus on the outcomes, the easier it is to A, find a global consensus, and B, keep up to speed with developments.
I've got an easy job, so I'll just echo what both panelists said. It's, look, I think, as a financial market participant, as a director of a regulated entity, I am absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of legislation, rules, guidance, technical standards, policies, procedures, that sometimes I feel I lose focus on terms of what the real risk is that we're trying to achieve. And every time there's a new product or every time there's a new topic, there's a whole new set of rules and requirements and standards that kick in. And when I was thinking about this, and again going back to policies and principles, again, we all want to achieve exactly the same thing. What are the expectations of conduct for the markets? We know what those are. I don't think there's any debate around what those are, and I've mentioned them before in terms of transparency and honesty and integrity and fairness, and expecting our regulated entities to act in an ethical way. I guarantee you that probably 90% of the enforcement actions that have been taken, if not more, all relate to those principles. And so when we go forward, my sort of takeaway is when you're thinking about creating new regulation and new standards or rules, if you come back to those principles and ensure those are in place, one, it allows for global adoption of those principles and policies. Two, it gives us from the business community a very clear understanding of what the expectations are from us from a conduct perspective. And then three, allows the flexibility in terms of digitalization, in terms of new developments which we don't even know about, AI adoption. We know what is expected of us. We don't need 1,000 rules and procedures and reporting requirements to do so. What we need is clarity in terms of making sure that we act with the relevant integrity in terms of what we do on a daily basis.
خالد.
في البداية راح أبتدي وين ما انتهى، أن فعلا المؤسسات المالية لديها العديد من الالتزامات، وذلك يأتي من دورها وأهميتها في المحافظة على الثقة في النظام المالي المعتمد، وذلك لأن أموال العملاء وأموال المستثمرين كلها عند المؤسسات المالية. ولكن لو ألخص المبادئ السلوك المهني، لو تم الالتزام فيها من جميع الأطراف المتعاملين، حققنا هدف حماية المستثمرين والنزاهة والنزاهة والشفافية في الأسواق المالية. اليوم الجهة الرقابية والمؤسسة المالية والمتعاملين كلنا في نفس القطاع لهدف واحد معين، وهو نمو هذا القطاع وزيادة المدخرات من خلال الاستثمارات. ممكن العبء الكبير على المؤسسات المالية بحكم تصرف بعض الأشخاص من خلال المؤسسات المالية. أهم موضوع ممكن أنه يتعلق بالمؤسسات المالية عملية الالتزام بالتشريعات والأنظمة التي تصدرها الجهات الرقابية، بالإضافة إلى المعايير الدولية، ووضع أنظمة رقابة داخلية تضمن عدم استقلال المعلومات والمحافظة على أموال العملاء، وبالتالي نصل إلى حماية المستثمرين في السوق المالي.
شكرا لك أستاذ خالد. نوعا ما كل التيكاويز أو المعلومات، يعني النصيحة الأخيرة على هذه البانل كلها تنصب في المعلومة وأهمية المعلومة. تقاطعتوا، في بعضكم قال أن القانون مهم، في بعضكم ركز على الجانب المالي، الجانب التقني والفني. فشكرا لكم. Thank you all. So as we wrap up today's insightful discussion, I want to express my sincere appreciation to our distinguished panelists and engaged audience, and to QFMA. Congratulations on this event, and thank you all for being part of this unique panel. One final remark, which is the closing remark, Mr. Tanjandir, please.
Thank you very much for this panel, and thank you, of course, for inviting me for these closing remarks. As we are coming to the end of the QFMA conference, let me start by, of course, thanking the QFMA, Excellencies who was there, Sheikh Bandar bin Mohammed bin Saud Al Thani, Chairman of the QFMA, its CEO, and dear friend, Dr. Thami bin Ahmed Al Bin Ali, and of course, everyone, the panelists, not only of just this panel, but the previous panels as well. So, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, we are coming to the end of a very fruitful QFMA conference following on from the last 3 days of very successful IOSCO meetings. And it is extraordinary. I was really struck how the themes that were discussed today at the QFMA's conference, whether it is about digital transformation, looking to the future, Islamic finance and sustainable finance, empowering SMEs and building and bridging markets, and market conduct and investor protection. They are so aligned with what IOSCO has been doing and has been actually talking about even over the last 3 days of IOSCO meetings. And that, of course, is not surprising because they all build on the objectives of IOSCO, which are, of course, the objectives of its members as well: investor protection, market integrity and efficiency, and financial stability. And therefore, what we were listening to, whether it is in this panel or on previous panels, was related to the work that IOSCO is doing in all the different areas, building on these 3 key objectives, whether it is the IOSCO work on fintech, on sustainable finance, on market development and inclusion. And here, just to build on the key takeaways that came from some of those panels, there was this discussion about democratization. Indeed, in this panel as well, you asked actually everyone about literacy, and we had some interesting conversations about what does literacy actually mean. Do we approach financial literacy only from the perspective of retail investors or also institutional investors, and understanding also that behind the institutional investors, behind everything, at the end of it all, there is the retail citizen, in a sense. So whether it's a pension fund or everything else. So these are some interesting thoughts that this gave rise to. Indeed, the whole discussion with regard to, for instance, Islamic finance and sustainable finance was very interesting because and I learned really for the first time what is the origin of Islamic finance when Dr. Faiz was talking about it from SC Malaysia. And it showed that the work that has happened on Islamic finance, or the work that IOSCO has been doing with regard to the sustainable finance, has come out of a need of investors. It's not coming out because we want to top-down impose any particular values on people, but it is something that investors are looking for, and that is a bridge. And that's why that was very interesting. The whole discussion that took place with regard to, for instance, the involvement of retail investors, and I should mention here the importance of the World Investor Week that IOSCO carries out, and a large number of jurisdictions, including yours, participates in that. Over 100 jurisdictions participate, 118 actually in the last one, with about 750 million people, the outreach to 750 million. So that's a huge thing there. We also had discussions with regard to capacity building. You brought up that point, and that is a key part of what IOSCO does. You have those programs that are available on our website. So I will not get into a lot of detail on each of these, but indeed, I was just bringing out how there were some striking similarities and alignment between the work that IOSCO does and the themes on this panel, and indeed what QFMA and other regulators in the region are doing. And the last point that I bring out about how striking the similarities are is that we are even sharing key milestones. The 20th anniversary of the QFMA and the 50th annual general meeting of IOSCO happening at the same time. So that tells you how striking these similarities have been. So I know that we are getting close to lunch, but I want to give you my own take on some of the discussions that happened, in fact, mostly on this panel, but also on previous panels. And that is taking something from the lunch and the delicious lunches that we've, of course, had. And I'm going to, again, thank you, Dr. Tammy, for this and for this organization. But let's take a dish, right? And that one of the famous dishes from here is the makbous, right? The makbous is there, and that's, so you have the ingredients that are there. You have rice, you have spices, you have other ingredients in that rice-based dish. But I would say that those ingredients, they are actually common to many dishes around the world. So I currently live in Spain because I'm in Madrid, where IOSCO is headquartered. And in Spain, the paella is a very famous dish. It has rice, it has some spices, it has many of the same ingredients. I come from India, which also has biryani, which also has some of these similar dishes. What am I driving at by talking about all this food and standing between you and lunch is basically saying that these ingredients that we're talking about, they are like the IOSCO objectives. They are like the basic IOSCO principles. And we were talking about a principles-based, outcomes-focused regime. And then what gets added on, whether it's the makbous here or whether it is the other dishes there, is the local flavor. So there are essential ingredients that are, I would say, the IOSCO standards. And then there is the beautiful local flavors that get added on. And that's not a cause necessarily for worry. That is actually something to celebrate as well. That you bring on the beautiful diversity on top of, but always on top of, the core standards and objectives and standards that IOSCO issues, because it does it with you, for you. And then you add on to that your local flavor, and that's the local flavor that we witnessed in the panel. So let me now finish with one thought that came up earlier, which is that all of what we do, whether it is in this panel, the previous panels, the IOSCO previous 3 days, boils down to one word. That word was mentioned earlier as well, and that one word is trust. Because it is trust that makes markets function. It is trust that allows markets to be even built. And the trust is about qualities that are not just of the head, but of the heart. And with that, I would say that we have witnessed this trust over the last few days, including today. Between members, we have seen the warmth that has come, of course, from the host, but from the members. It is that trust that is not just between market participants, but between regulators that we all have seen. I would say there has been extraordinary trust that has allowed the last few days of annual meetings to be conducted. There have been extraordinary trust between the QFMA team, the IOSCO Secretariat team, that made the annual meetings and the conference such a huge success. And the last point about trust is that I'm sure that we will all continue to work together fruitfully and productively, and that we will be meeting for a successful annual conference and annual meeting in 2026 in Egypt. So all that remains now for me to be said. Excellencies, Dr. Tammy, is to, of course, thank all the distinguished speakers who have participated in today's wonderful panels. Thanks to the extraordinary team at the QFMA, Dr. Tammy, Chairman who was here previously, Chairman Sheikh Al Thani, and of course Noor, Zayed, Al-Shamali and team. Thanks also, of course, to the team of the chairman of IOSCO, Jean-Paul Servais. Thanks, of course, I would repeat especially my thanks to Derville here, because as I mentioned yesterday, this is her last IOSCO annual meeting as an IOSCO member, but not necessarily only as, but we hope that we do see you again in future meetings. And the last is, of course, I would thank, last but not the least, I would thank my team from the Secretariat, led by Rodrigo, who had opened this conference today, but also the whole team that consisted of Angelo, Corina, Vanessa, Tim, Chris, Raluca, Alp, Cecil, Isabel, Josafat, as well as all the staff back home. So thank you to all of them. And thank you for sharing this applause that I will take back to my team, but also it is for all of you. And with that, I declare the QFMA conference closed. Thank you, and have a very good day. Thank you.